October 1st, 1946. The world holds its breath in Nuremberg, Germany, inside a courthouse where the fate of Nazi Germany's highest-ranking survivors is about to be sealed. The Allies preside over historical justice as 21 notorious leaders stand trial for the horrors they unleashed across an entire continent. Their actions wove death into the fabric of Europe. Today they would hear the verdict of mankind. Among them sat Hans Frank, the notorious butcher of Poland. Moments later, he is sentenced to death for crimes so terrible that their scars still linger over Europe's heart. Before we pull back the curtain on this chilling story, take a second. If you crave the uncomfortable truths of history, the stories that textbooks dare not cover, smash subscribe and join Fleek of History. Be sure to hit that bell icon. This is content that changes the way you see the past. Early life, from privileged beginnings to ruthless ambition. Hans Michael Frank's journey began on May 23, 1900, in Karlsruhe, Germany. His upbringing appeared conventional, a father respected in law and a mother descending from a wealthy banking family. Beneath that image, however, trouble brewed. At age 10, Frank's stable family collapsed when his mother abandoned them for another man. A trauma that would etch bitterness and toxic pride into the young boy's character. During his teens in Munich, Frank excelled academically, but felt unmoored amidst the political and economic chaos that engulfed post-World War I Germany. As a teenager, he joined the army in World War I's fading days, receiving only a taste of combat before Germany's humiliating defeat. Feeling betrayed and humiliated, Frank returned to a nation roiled by revolution. He joined the violent paramilitary Freikorps, bands of embittered veterans who battled communist rebels in Germany's streets. For Frank, violence became a path to belonging and power, his first taste of what unchecked force could achieve. But Frank wanted more than street brawls. He craved meaning. He soon found it in radical politics, joining the shadowy Thule Society, part secret club, part occultist gathering, and entirely obsessed with nationalist myth. Here he connected with the founders of what would become the Nazi Party, which Frank joined in its infancy. By 1923, he stood with Hitler's brown shirts for the beer hall putsch, Hitler's first, bloody failed coup. The legal mind that built a tyranny after the putsch's collapse, Frank used his legal talents to climb the Nazi ladder. Hitler's personal lawyer and architect of the Nazis' legal strategy, Frank wasn't just a bureaucrat. He was a visionary of repression. Frank designed laws that stripped Jews, communists and dissidents of their rights, using courtroom victories to mask the regime's criminality in the trappings of statecraft. His success brought him high posts: Minister of Justice for Bavaria, leader of the Nazi Party's legal affairs, and later Reichsleiter, one of the regime's inner leadership. Frank built the Academy for German Law, weaponizing law to reflect Nazi ideology. Law existed not for justice, but to protect and advance the Aryan community at the expense of all others. Yet Frank's brilliant legal mind was always paired with callous self-advantage. Friends described him as insecure, arrogant, and obsessed with status. When he married Brigitte Herbst, a sharp, socially ambitious woman in her own right, Frank seemed to have it all: power, wealth, and a growing family. But their relationship was famously cold. Their 5 children were often caught in the crossfire of their parents' ambition and discontent. Nazi. Occupation, turning Poland into a killing ground. Everything changed in September 1939 when Germany invaded Poland, unleashing World War II in Europe. Shortly after, Frank was appointed Governor-General of the General Government, the Nazi-occupied middle third of Poland. Here Frank created an empire of terror. Obeying the orders of Hitler and Himmler, Frank's mission was clear. Poland would become both a labor colony for the Reich and a dumping ground for Europe's Jews. He did not shy away from this mission. Upon arriving in Krakow, Frank declared, "Poland is to be treated as a colony. The Poles will become the slaves of the greater German world empire." And so began one of the most brutal occupation regimes in modern history. Under Frank's iron fist, Polish society was systematically destroyed. Intellectuals were hunted and executed. The Catholic Church, the soul of Polish identity, was looted, its clergy imprisoned or killed. Frank directed waves of forced labor deportations, each shipment tearing families apart. Any act of resistance, Frank announced, "shall be paid for in blood." And it was. The Nazis executed thousands in mass reprisals and public shootings, while terrorizing countless more. Holocaust in full operation, the ghetto and the camps nowhere was Frank's cruelty clearer than in his treatment of the Jews. Ghettos were walled off in Krakow, Warsaw and Lublin, thousands torn from homes, crammed into squalor, starved and exposed to disease. The Nazi planners calculated their daily rations at starvation levels, an average of 184 calories, compared to over 2,000 for Germans. Bodies littered the sidewalks each day. Death carts patrolled, collecting the evidence of hunger and disease. From the ghettos, Frank oversaw the beginning of the final solution on Polish soil. The extermination camps of Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec and Majdanek occupied territory under his rule. Frank was fully informed. He noted in meetings that near Lublin, there's a concentration camp the size of a city. When mass deportations began, he boasted that his government was on the cutting edge of the Jewish question. By the end of his reign in Poland, millions, Polish Jews, Catholics and political dissidents had been murdered. Frank was feared and despised. Polish underground newspapers mockingly named his kingdom Frank Reich, the empire of Frank. Hypocrisy, the king and queen of theft, while Poland descended into horror. Frank and his family lived in obscene comfort. He requisitioned Krakow's Wawel Castle as his personal residence, a palace literally stolen from Poland's kings. His wife Brigitte relished the luxury, traveling by chauffeured Mercedes into the ghettos to buy furs and jewelry at a fraction of their worth, wresting valuables from the desperate. Frank gathered a private art collection of world-class masterpieces, including Da Vinci's Lady with an Ermine. Every weekend, the family retreated to a lavish country estate, where trains carrying Jewish families to Auschwitz rumbled by. It was, his son would later recall, the silence of complicity. Frank, artist and pianist, even courted the approval of composers. But his private circle knew the truth. Under his cultured veneer lay a cold, power-obsessed soul, desperation and collapses. Germany's war fortunes faded in 1944-1945. Frank's authority began to slip. He made speeches denouncing arbitrary police power, even urging the restoration of independent courts, an act born less of conscience than of political maneuvering. Desperate as Soviet armies closed in, Frank tried to resign many times. Hitler refused. When the Nazis abandoned Krakow, he fled with trucks full of stolen art, desperate for an escape to South America. Instead, the American army arrested him in Bavaria. At capture, Frank, a man who had ordered millions to die, broke down. He was beaten by GIs, then attempted suicide twice while awaiting trial, terrified by visions of his own execution. The Nuremberg trials, confession, repentance, or manipulation? At Nuremberg, Frank stood before the world, his own diaries providing damning evidence of his role in genocide and exploitation. Many Nazi leaders denied everything. Frank took a mixed path. He accepted personal guilt, converted to Catholicism, and declared ownership of the suffering in Poland. 1,000 years will pass, and the guilt of Germany will not be erased, he told the court. Yet he still tried to minimize responsibility, blaming others for the camps, denying he'd ordered mass murder directly. The court, however, was unmoved by his late-in-life honesty. Frank was found guilty of crimes against humanity and sentenced to hang. The painful end, botched hanging on the gallows, on October 16, 1946, justice finished its work. Hans Frank, dressed in prison garb, was led to the gallows. He was the fifth Nazi to die that night. Executioner Sergeant John C. Woods performed a series of rushed, infamous hangings, deliberately using short drops. For Frank, the end came not swiftly. Rather than a quick, merciful snap, the rope failed to break his neck. Instead, he strangled slowly, convulsing and gasping for nearly 11 minutes. Witnesses described it as a ghastly spectacle, a cruel but ironic echo of his own legacy of suffering. His corpse was cremated and his ashes dumped in a local river. No gravestone, no monument, just the wind and current to carry away what was left of Hans Frank. The aftermath, a family and a nation in ruins. Frank's death did not end the suffering he inflicted. His wife Brigitte, left unprotected and impoverished, sold off stolen artwork and jewelry in a futile attempt to survive. She died in 1959, embittered and alone. Their children were haunted by the family legacy. Most lived troubled lives, some openly defending their father, some wrestling with shame and guilt for decades. Nicholas Frank, the youngest son, wrote a searing exposé denouncing his father and the curse of being the child of a Nazi monster. The family's pain is a reminder that evil reverberates through generations, staining even those who had no hand in the crimes. Why we must remember, Hans Frank's journey from promising lawyer to master of genocide is one of history's starkest warnings. He shows how ambition without conscience, intelligence without empathy, and power without morality lead straight to the abyss. If this story moved you, if you believe history's uncomfortable truths should never be hidden, subscribe to Fleek of History right now. Firm in knowledge, we armor ourselves against the return of such darkness. Smash that bell. Stay close. We'll keep shining history's flashlight into the world's darkest corners together. In remembering Hans Frank and his painful execution, we are remembering the voices silenced and the lives destroyed. May justice's voice always thrum louder,